So really excited for you're here to join us today for the session around how do we really deliver business value as you go through a cloud transformation. My name is Chris Hennessy. I'm an enterprise strategist inside of AWS. It's a team of about 15 CXOs who've led large-scale transformations going through a cloud transformation. For me, I'd been with AWS about 18 months, and prior to then, I was an IT CFO leading through Capital One's digital transformation. So I spent over 20 years at Capital One, and now we spend time with customers developing content, but also doing speaking opportunities to share insights, not only from our experience, but also from the customers that we engage throughout the year.
Hey everyone, my name is Jake Burns. I'm also an enterprise strategist, and I was formerly with Live Nation Ticketmaster.
I don't think you want my face twice, so yeah.
All right, so in this session, we're going to talk about mainly three sections. So where business value from the cloud really comes from. Second, how we can ensure you get that value, so more on the execution side. And then finally, how to build a business case that will provide a win for both IT and finance and for the entire organization.
Thanks, Jake. So we spend a lot of time with customers talking about what are the ways to deliver business value. Typically, as we engage with those in technology, they get really excited about the technology, the services, and the capabilities. But there's a lot of times you need to bridge the gap inside of your organization around how can you ensure this is linked back to changing the business trajectory, maybe generating new growth, new products, capabilities, or making things more effective. So we're going to dive deeper into where business value comes from and leverage a framework that AWS has called the Cloud Value Framework, which is a good start. And I'll pull up the 4 pillars, and there's a 5th pillar that's just been added. So you'll see here around cost savings, developer productivity, resiliency, and then agility. And the 5th pillar that's just been added is around sustainability and the impact on the environment. So this is a really helpful framework, and one that if you engage with AWS, they tend to leverage as they think about what value you should expect as you go through a cloud transformation. But obviously, as many of you know in your experiences, while this is a great start, there's obviously just the tip of the iceberg as you go through the transformation itself. So being the analyst and the finance person, I'm going to share some numbers. So I think you all will find value in that. And these could be helpful benchmarks as you go back to your organization. First up is the average infrastructure reduction in spend we tend to see. The range is really 20 to 40%. 20% is the average that's there because there are some workloads that are a little less efficient. But overall, driving IT cost efficiency is a big reason why customers go to the cloud. Secondly is around that productivity and the ways in which, and many of you as developers may know, having access to technology and infrastructure when needed, being able to spin that up and spin that down on demand is a big win. So your ability to have that, you can be way more productive in the way in which you develop. Third is around resiliency and security. And obviously, as you modernize and take advantage of cloud technologies, our customers tend to see much better resiliency as you go through the cloud itself. Adoption. And then lastly, obviously, is agility. There was a really interesting study that AWS did around looking at about 1,000 customers that went through a cloud transformation before and after. And the number one reason and value delivered actually was agility as you go through this transformation. Most customers I meet with, they tend to lean in based on the cost savings and the efficiencies they can gain. But very quickly, they'll realize as they go through this transformation of how you can take advantage of agility and the ways in which you can drive efficiency in leveraging the cloud. Really interesting study here I thought was value because a lot of the questions I get from CIOs or CTOs or CFOs is how is the cloud transformation going to impact the bottom line? Not only the value proposition we just saw, but there was also a study done with Hackett recently in the last 6 months that actually looked at comparables of customers that have gone through a cloud transformation with AWS versus customers in a benchmark that they haven't, and looked at the comparison of a couple of key metrics to see how did it change around the dynamics. These are all publicly traded companies, so just keep in mind we had to use that for the data. But you can see across the metrics, the top one is earnings. The second one is enterprise value to sales, like what's the total value of the organization. Third is revenue per employee, and then the bottom is around cost savings and the SG&A. And you can see across all dimensions a material benefit outsized the peer group of going through a cloud transformation. And yet that 4 times is a good soundbite you can take away as you go through that. But if you look around duration of that, you can see it kind of scales through time. And I know many of you, I don't know where you are on the spectrum of this, But as you mature as an organization, as you reskill in terms of being cloud native and the capabilities, as you build up some of that agility in the organization, you get even bigger impacts as you go through time. So if you look at the duration and the analysis that was done there for both earnings, revenue, and percent of sales reduction of cost, the longer you go through this journey, the more mature you get through this journey in leveraging AWS, the bigger impact it will have in your organization relative to peer organizations who are not going through this transformation. And I know for those who go through this, you kind of get it, but obviously having anecdotes and data to back up the strategy that you put together is really helpful when you engage with, especially business leaders inside of your organization who may not be able to connect the dots as they see the technology and how it will change. So I'll turn it back to Jake to share a little bit of real life example of going through this transformation.
Thanks, Chris. So at Live Nation, we went all in with AWS, and we did that back in 2016, 2017. And we used the cloud value framework to kind of measure the benefits. And like Chris was saying before, it's a start, but I think there's more to value than this, but we'll go over this very quickly. So by going all in with AWS, we were able to reduce our costs by 48%. Now, initially, that was 18% cost reduction with the lift and shift migration, and then we got an additional 30% after optimizing in the cloud. And so our end result was a 48% reduction in TCO. So a lot of cost savings there. Productivity, 50% reduction in traditional IT tasks, and it led to a 10x increase in new application. Now that's our capability. You know, that might be scary to a finance professional. It sounds expensive. But one of the things we realized when we were in the cloud was that we had this ability to turn things off and stop paying for them. And so we deployed more things. We experimented more, but we actually shut a lot of things off that didn't add value. So about roughly 4 to 5 of those new applications we shut off. So it was about a doubling of applications, but the end result was the quality of those applications in regards to what the business cared about, value to the customers, revenue, et cetera, went way up. Our resilience was also, went from 3 nines to 5 nines, which I was a little embarrassed about the 3 nines of availability, so I was very happy to get that up to 5 nines for our organization. And you know, I always say be very kind of wary of anyone who says 100% anything, especially in IT. But in this case, we actually were able to get rid of 100% of our performance problems related to IT infrastructure. And that's related to the agility that we had in the cloud, the ability to just dial everything up to 11, see where it needs to be, and then ratchet it down to the high water mark. And last but not least, agility. So we had a typical 3 to 6 month lead time for new applications in IT when we were in the data center. We got that down to 72 hours. Now, if you asked us at the time, and you ask anyone who's there, they would say, well, we could deploy an application in 10 minutes. We added a little bit of time on top of that for governance, which I think is a fair trade-off. So it ended up being about 72 hours, which is still much, much faster, but also safe. So like I was saying, there's more than just these things. And this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, like where does business value really come from in the cloud? Because cost savings is great and all of these other things are great, but that's not the whole story. So how do you measure the value of not having to do the work that you no longer have to do? The time and effort you no longer need to do, the upgrade cycles, capacity planning, managing contracts, the risk you no longer have to live with of getting those things wrong. How do you measure the value of being able to focus on what matters? And we're talking about developing products and services, inventing on behalf of your customers, being able to refocus that effort that you used to spend on all those undifferentiated things and focus on what matters. Where's that value captured? And your ability to innovate, right? Everybody wants to innovate. It's become this big buzzword, right? And we'll talk a little bit about where innovation comes from. But how do you measure the value of your increased decision-making ability, your increased velocity, and your increased frequency of your organization to make decisions? So let's talk about where innovation comes from, right? So in order to innovate, we have to be able to experiment. We need to be able to try many different ideas. And the problem with that is experiments, most of them fail. If they don't fail, then they're probably not experiments. And Jeff Bezos wrote about this in 2015 letter to shareholders. He wrote, failure and invention are inseparable twins. To invent, you have to experiment. And if you know in advance that it's going to work, it's not an experiment. See, most organizations embrace the idea of invention, but they're not willing to suffer the failed experiments needed to get there. So if we're willing to accept that innovation and invention are enabled by experimentation, and that most of those experiments are going to fail, and some of those can be very costly, it kind of explains why most organizations traditionally don't experiment very often, because the cost of failure is very high, and you're going to fail often. So it's a very rational position to have. But by not experimenting, they're missing out on a lot of innovation. So if we want to experiment more, the key is to lower the cost of failure. So one way we could think about this is looking at an example of digital photography. So how do professional photographers create such beautiful photographs? You know, a lot of them are geniuses. But in reality, most of those pictures get thrown away. They just show the world the very best ones. The difference between then and now is in the old days, and some of you might be old enough to remember this, we used to develop film. You get, 24 shots in a roll of film, and you didn't know what you had until you got it developed. Right? So there's a very long cycle time. And you imagine you take those shots, maybe take 100 shots, and you develop them, and they're all wrong. None of them are good. You have to go climb that mountain again and try again, right, in a week or however long it takes. But then digital photography came around, and now things are different. Now you could basically just hold down that shutter button, take 10,000 pictures, pick the best one, instantly know which ones are good, and then double down on those through post-processing and end up with a great shot. So what the digital camera did was it changed the rules of the game from having to get it right the first time to only needing to be right once. And so this is how agility allows us to lower the cost of failure. You can, at any time, end experiments that aren't working. You can course correct often and frequently. And when you operate this way, you're able to uncover new opportunities and solve problems in new ways that you didn't think was ever possible, and for far less cost. Agility is a lot of things. It's going from idea to production in days instead of months. It's being able to abandon unsuccessful projects and experiments without having to suffer those sunk costs. It's having elastic capacity so you can serve your customers, but just as importantly, so you can scale down when you don't need those resources and pay less. And it's being able to try many different things to continually improve and find the best ideas. And that's the one, that I like to focus on. Agility is an investment in your future ability to make good decisions. Traditionally, we spend a lot of time and effort going through trying to predict the future. And because the consequences for being wrong is traditionally so high. But if instead we invest that time and energy into increasing our agility, we no longer have to predict the future. The cost of failure is now so low that we can experiment often and find out what works by actually doing it. Agility changes the rules of the game, just like with digital photography, the same with the cloud, with traditional computing, from needing to get it right the first time to only needing to be right once. We can experiment with ideas quickly and inexpensively, without extensive analysis and planning. And we can step outside our comfort zone. It's easy to be bold when we're no longer afraid of the consequences. And this is what it means to truly transform. It's about having capabilities that allow you to completely transform the way you think about your business. It's about being able to do things that you never thought was possible. And this, in my opinion, is the real business case for cloud. Sorry, I got stuck there. Just like with digital photography, if you look at the old pictures, this is how a traditional data center operates. It takes time. Mistakes have big consequences. And so we learn to play it safe. But being in the cloud is more like digital photography. You were able to use this amazing technology, and we get much better results with much less time invested at a much lower cost. The cloud enables agility in a number of ways. For example, going from a pay-for-consumption model allows us to adapt as needed versus having to guess and be right. It allows us to always have access to the best technology. AWS has 200 plus services, compute, database, AI/ML, contact center as a service, all of these things, versus having only the capabilities that you chose to invest in the past. It allows you to focus on what will really make a difference, like serving our customers and growing our business, versus having to manage the undifferentiated complexity of data centers with capacity planning and all that comes with it. So if we look back at this cloud value framework, you could see it's actually agility that powered all of these things. It's really just one thing, in my opinion. Our cost savings was a result of us being able to pay for less and use less, or pay for more and use more. And so we matched our capacity to our utilization as closely as possible, and we were able to get that down. This is the big secret of cost optimization. You know, everybody's trying to sell a product, and they say they have the answer. In the cloud, the way you reduce your costs is delete what you're not using and right-size everything else. And it's not a phase two. It's something that is part of your operations forever. But that's a good thing, because it allows us to continually be more and more efficient. Our increase in productivity, the 10x increase in new applications, is only possible when you have instant access to new technology. And that resilience and the reduction in performance problems was directly related to us being able to try over and over and over again to find architecture that was the most resilient. Not necessarily that the cloud was more resilient than our data center. It was that we were able to architect it and find the right answer.
Now that the case for cloud is so compelling, I know as we talk to customers, it's much harder to implement and see that vision in organizations as you think about the people, the culture, the governance dynamics that exist inside of organizations. So we thought it would be helpful to use the next section to talk about what are some of the patterns of success we've seen with other customers through our experiences personally that you could take as an inspiration back to your organization as you think about the delivery of cloud transformation. There's 4 patterns that you'll see as we go through this. I'll describe, and then we're going to do a double click into each one of these as we go through the conversation. So the first is constraints, and obviously, as you read through the context there, I think there's things evolve organizationally quite often. We'll talk about some 2 different examples or types of constraints. Ways in which you can leverage, ways in which they're forced upon you. I know I meet with a lot of smaller businesses and startups who are, as you go through economic turmoil, there's a lot of change that can happen in terms of a focus on efficiency versus a focus on growth. I know in large enterprises, sometimes you need to find ways to get things mobilized and moved, and constraints and declarations are good ways to do that. So we'll spend some time on that. The next is around buy-in. We hear a lot from customers around how do you get people aligned around a strategy but bought into what's expected? How do you get teams bought into the vision and the strategy as you think about the change that's involved? So we'll do a double click into buy-in as well. Momentum's a very important thing, and it can work in your favor or not in your favor in terms of momentum in your organization. But there are some ways in which you could take advantage of momentum in your organization and company, and we'll talk about some examples by which you can leverage momentum, and that could be through maybe a leadership change, it could be through the economic changes, it could be just internal changes that are occurring that you could take advantage of to accelerate your benefits in engaging in the cloud. And then last, obviously, is accountability. This is really critical as you think about, especially as Jake mentioned, some of the examples of how to use the cloud effectively, how do you see through that strategy and deliver on this, but how do you actually get alignment and you have the right level of authority in your organization to make the move that you're looking to make. So these are the 4 patterns we're going to leverage, and I'll go first through the constraints one. So as you think about constraints, and kind of you can read through here that born out of necessity, there's a great quote that Jeff Bezos, and a very famous quote that you can read through, that talks about frugality as one of the leadership principles and the dynamics of businesses around using innovation as a way, and constraints around money and spend as a way to do that. And it's all using that as a way from an invention standpoint. As I mentioned, a lot of the organizations and companies I talk to now, and if you read some articles, there tends to be, in these economic turmoil, a lot of startups get created because there's some circumstances and dynamics of opportunities that exist. Really taking advantage of constraints as a way in which to fuel your business, but also using this as a way to force change inside of your organization. So I'll talk about 2 types. One is a forced constraint, and one is a created constraint. So there's a couple ways in which, I'll share some customer examples by which they've taken advantage of each of these types of constraints as a way to accelerate their modernization in the cloud. First up are force constraints, and I just put a couple of examples there. I'm sure you can think of your own examples as well. there's a lot of change that's happening in our ecosystem, and a lot of change that drives innovation. I know I've read some case studies of Moderna specifically with the pandemic and the ways in which we all experienced vaccination transformation. I talked to a lot of companies who either are getting acquired or are divesting a business. It's forcing them to make change, and it's really lasering in on a way to prioritize inside of organizations. That's where these constraints tend to help. The next is around created constraints, and this is probably the practice I see most inside of organizations. And typically, it's either come from a top-down standpoint of we must be out of data centers by this date, or it can be bottoms up as well in terms of the ways in which you have capacity or resources available. But I think using declarations and thinking about constraints can be really powerful as you go through this. I know through my example, when I was back at Capital One, I'll talk about the one on the far right, we get asked questions a lot. I know, Jake, you probably get this as well, which is, what is the one KPI that matters as you go through a cloud transformation? And it's very hard to answer that question. I think each of us have a different point of view. But from a financial standpoint, one of the ones I really like is called efficiency ratio. And what that is total company cost divided by total company revenue. So it's a way in which you get scale and efficiency as you grow your business. And you can influence that by either growing revenue or reducing cost. But Capital One decided to leverage back in 2019. It was something called 42 and 21. We had a dynamic where we loved anything that was 5 words or less. So that's a good constraint for you to think about as you think about your cloud strategy. I know I love asking customers, what's your cloud strategy? I tend to not get very clear answers. It can get a little confusing. But using the 5 word or less can be an interesting way for your organization to remember whatever that desired outcome is. So 42 and 21 was 42% efficiency ratio in a couple years out in the future in 2021. This was a great forcing function, not only externally with shareholders, but also internally as a way as galvanizing of delivering as much value as you can as you go through this, of either growing the business or driving efficiency. So I would really encourage you as you go through your journey around what role can constraints play in your dynamics in your organization. Date-driven dynamics I know come up a lot with customers where they either have a facility exit or there's an acquisition or integration, must be done by this date. I think it's really critical as you go through this that there's clear plans behind these declarations. You can't just make the declaration and then kind of assume it's all going to work out. So I think really thinking through as you use declarations, make sure you have the backing behind what's going to come from that. So Jake's going to share some more about the specifics around it.
Thank you, Chris. So we'll talk about time constraints first. So a deadline forces you to begin before you're ready. So we engage with a lot of customers. We do, I think, about an average of 150 per strategist per year. So we get to see a lot of transformations. And I'm 4 years into this role and 700 plus engagements into this role. And I'm still surprised to see so many organizations that are stuck on step one. It's still a top reason that many enterprises are stalled. The fact of the matter is, if you wait until you're ready, you're probably going to be waiting forever. Instead, you become ready by taking action. Deadline forces you to focus on what matters. When there isn't enough time to do everything, we prioritize. We cut out the least important tasks and the things that matter the least. We're left with things that will actually move the needle, the things that matter the most, the things that we must be done for us to achieve our goals. And these are precisely the things we need to focus on to be successful. A deadline forces you to have a goal and work backwards from it. When we went all in with AWS at Live Nation, I had a 12-month deadline. We got it done in 17. I think if I had a 17-month deadline, it would have taken us 24. Another kind of constraint is budgets. I know Chris is a fan of these.
Well, it depends personally or professionally. Yeah.
So budget forces you to become lean, just like with deadlines. Having a tight budget, it makes us cut out what isn't absolutely necessary. It forces us to focus on what's truly important. And when you get lean, you can go fast. A budget forces you to invent and simplify. In general, simple solutions are less expensive than complex ones. They also tend to be more robust. And a budget forces you to innovate. I think there's this misconception about innovation. I see a lot of organizations throwing a lot of resources towards innovation, creating innovation labs. And while those could work, it's like Chris said earlier, innovation typically isn't born out of excess resources. It's born out of a necessity. And so when we have a task to do, our first instinct is to do it the way we've always done it, the way that other people have always done it. But when we're under these constraints, we're forced to find a new way. And that's why invention comes from constraints, because it forces us to not take the easy path and to come up with a better path. Now, we won't always be successful with that, but in order to try, we need to have the motivation to try. Now, I don't recommend having a frozen headcount. This was a constraint that was forced upon me, but it actually ended up being a blessing in disguise. It forced me to really learn how to motivate my existing team because I couldn't hire anyone new. I had to find a way to make it work. So initially, they were really concerned about job security, and they were right. I was asking them to engineer themselves out of a job, but I was also asking them to create better jobs for themselves, and this is exactly what they did. Once they understood this, they became bought in. And they understood they'd be learning new skills, trained, certified, given hands-on experience, and they were going to have a lot more fun in their job. My frozen headcount also forced me to upskill my current team because I couldn't hire anyone new. What I've learned in the past 4 years, it confirms my experience as a customer, that it's much easier to take people who understand your organization and teach them how to do cloud than to bring in cloud experts and then teach them how your organization works. It's also great for morale. So it's good to do this investment in your team, but also communicate that you're doing it. They need to understand. Otherwise, they're going to be scared, right? So tell them, I'm investing in you because we need to get this done and we're depending on you, and you're going to have a better future. So instead of hiring cloud engineers, which is a topic of a different talk, but I'll be doing a repeat of that on Thursday if you're interested. I had a saying, I don't hire cloud engineers, I build them, or I create them. I didn't have the ability to hire new people, so I had to take the people I had and turn them into cloud engineers. And Live Nation All-In story is proof that that's possible. My frozen headcount forced me to be able to create the talent I needed. So use constraints as a forcing function. Begin before you feel ready. Utilize time and resource constraints as forcing functions for innovation. And focus on motivating and upskilling the people you already have. They're truly your keys to success. So let's talk a little bit about buy-in. Much of my time with enterprise leaders is focused on maximizing productivity of their workforce. Everyone wants to be efficient. The impact of things like training and incentives is pretty much well understood. But this concept of buy-in is often overlooked, and I think that's a mistake. Bought employees don't need to be told to work. They want to work. So when they're fully bought in, when they understand why they're doing this, they'll just do it. They don't have to be forced. So we can turn resistance into enthusiasm in our workforce if we can convince them of a few things. First, why? And this isn't why IT is doing this. This is why as a business we're doing this. How we're transforming our company is going to allow us to create more value for customers. People need a mission, an important reason for the work they're doing in order to have the motivation needed to fulfill their full potential. A big part of this is giving them a sense of purpose. So give them that purpose. Also, how? How are we going to do this? Nobody wants to be part of a failed project. People want to win, and they want to be on the team that wins. They need to believe that the mission is attainable. So share the plan with them and let them be part of the planning process. They'll work much harder to ensure that their plan is successful than they will to ensure your plan is successful. And last but not least, explain what's in it for them. No matter how much they care about your company and your organization and your customers, your employees are always going to prioritize themselves. And this is a human thing. This doesn't mean that they're selfish. We're all selfish in this way. So the fortunate thing is the truth is on our side. These transformations are an opportunity to transform your career. Those folks that worked for me at Live Nation, they're all rock stars today. They've all trained, certified, hands-on experience. No one else did it. They did it. And so it's a great thing for your career. And so being able to articulate that is very important. It's an opportunity of a lifetime. So make sure you tell them this. Same thing with stakeholders. Bought-in stakeholders will work with you instead of against you. And you're probably familiar with the politics and silos in most organizations. You're probably in the middle of it. This is a very real thing. So they also need to know why. They need to know why we're doing this as an organization, the business benefits, not why I'm doing this, why we're all doing this, and how we're going to win. When they understand the full scope of transforming really means, they'll be much more interested in being a part of it. Also, share the plan. They want to be part of something that's very important to the organization, but also that's going to succeed. So share your plan with them. Make it their plan. And also what's in it for them. Now with stakeholders, this is a little different than with employees. It's not going to transform their career quite as much as taking an infrastructure server admin, turning them into a cloud architect, but it will make their life better. So for example, traditional IT, a lot of applications run out of disk space, and it's a big emergency to figure out what to delete or go procure more disks. So tell them a story. That's the old way. You're very familiar with that. Well, in this new world, we'll be able to add it automatically. And you're worried about cost? Well, I could tell you what the cost is up to the hour. Every hour, I can give you an updated version of the cost, full cost transparency for the first time ever. So that's just an example, but you get the picture. Paint that picture for them. Let them see how much better things will be for them. And after you've communicated these things, you have to deliver upon them. The communication will get the initial buy-in, but them to fully earn their trust, you have to actually deliver. So people want to be a part of something successful, and they need to know what's in it for them. So get buy-in from your employees to overcome resistance and create enthusiasm, and from your stakeholders, so they will work with you instead of against you. Explain the why to give them a mission and sense of purpose, and share your plans with them so they're invested in making it work. Explain what's in it for them so they can see how they will personally benefit. So one of the things that we've learned, and this is something that's been very apparent to me, that transformations that are stalled tend to stay stalled. That is, unless significant action is taken. This is similar to Newton's law of physics from classical physics, or the law of motion. A body at rest will remain at rest until acted upon by a force. Slides out of order. But transformations that are progressing will tend to continue progressing unless something significant disrupts that progress. And that's why it's so important to get momentum going in your favor. It's funny, like after 700 some odd conversations with different companies, I could usually tell about 10 minutes in whether they're on the right track or not. And what I'm looking for is momentum going in their favor. Have they built momentum towards that goal or haven't they? And that can predict with a high degree of accuracy whether they'll be successful, unless they change things. So here's a chart of what transformation looks like. And this was certainly the case for me. See, real transformation and real change is hard for most people. They're invested in the status quo, and they have fear and uncertainty, fear of the unknown. But really interesting thing happens as you make progress. The farther you go, the more people start jumping on the bandwagon. All those people who resisted the change in the beginning suddenly become supporters. So if you're leading a transformation and you feel resistance from all around you, you're really not alone. We've all gone through this. The key is to start winning as early as possible. So think big, but start small. The key is to get a small series of wins to demonstrate to everyone involved that this is moving forward and get that momentum going forward. And the good news is you will get all the support you need, but after you need it. So start small and build a series of wins. Get that momentum going in the right direction. Think big, but start small. Realize that you won't get the support until after you need it. And share the credit, even with those that resisted in the beginning.
Great. I'll talk about accountability. And one point I'd love to just emphasize that Jake mentioned is the importance of communication of the strategy. I know when I engage with customers, a lot of times it's very unclear inside the organization of what their strategy is and what the plan is to get there. And organizations tend to underinvest in the communication elements of what's needed from a change management. So love that suggestion that you gave, Jake, and definitely would emphasize for all of you to think through how you're leveraging that. So let's talk about accountability, because this is, you may hide from this, you may run towards this, I'm not sure your personality, but as you think about going through a cloud transformation, it's really key in running your business around having good accountability inside of your organization. And if you look at this kind of 2x2 matrix that's here with authority and accountability, Accountability is almost useless without the authority to do it. And authority without accountability can also lead to poor decision making. So inside of your organization, you need to find a good balance between those who have authority, but also those who are accountable as you're managing through a transformation. And typically when they're in balance is when organizations deliver results inside of the company. So as you think about accountability, it's really making sure that they're in balance. I know from my experience, a lot of times as you engage with customers, somebody in authority, maybe a senior leader in technology, may have clarity around what they intend to do, but they don't feel accountable towards delivering, especially towards business outcomes that exist. Or somebody can also feel, especially for me, I talk a lot about cloud financial management and the ways in which to use cloud in a cost-effective way. I'll see a lot of companies struggle with managing centrally cloud costs and wondering why people aren't taking the right actions or the right behaviors because they don't have transparency into that. So those engineers don't feel very accountable towards that because they have no idea in this large enterprise what they're actually incurring. So it's really tending to find the balance as you think about all elements. And I know for me, as I give this example around cloud financial management, how do you strike the balance? Because typically budgets are managed at a very senior level inside of organizations, but engineers are the ones with hands on keyboard spinning up instances and leveraging services. So you really need to find that middle point. And for me, I know just from my personal experience, I tend to narrow in on the application owner as a key element and the person, for me, that I tend to see in large enterprises who found the balance of accountability and authority. But you all can find the balance of what makes best for your organization. But I think it's really important to do that as you go through this because availability of systems, resiliency of them is just as important as the cost effectiveness of how you're running that as well. So as you think about, we're going to pivot a little bit as you think about the elements of accountability of incentives. This comes up a lot. Jake mentioned in the first 10 minutes, you can quickly tell what's going on. I just had a customer, I won't share the customer, I just had a customer engagement right before this, and I could tell within 5 minutes, so not even 10 minutes, there's problems. And it's a lot of vertical siloed strategies, not an integrated strategy across the organization. Everybody has their own impediments and what's going on. So you can quickly identify really where there's an opportunity to work together inside of an organization. But usually it's around the incentive structure that drives a lot of behaviors inside of the organization. So, and we'll talk a little bit here around like performance management or individual incentives. And sometimes high performers can get frustrated through a transformation because they feel like the organization's holding them back. And then sometimes, obviously, especially in an agile construct, when there's a low performer, they're the ones that need the help and the support as they're needing the reskilling and the efforts that are going on. So just know that it's not one size fits all as you go through this. We see a lot of practices inside of organizations that you need to support both ends of that. But everything Jake mentioned around the mission, the purpose, what it means for them, but also, obviously, creating the right incentive structure in your organization is really important as you go through a transformation.
Thanks, Chris. I could do it in 5 minutes also. I was counting the first 5 minutes as introductions. So, another buzzword, meritocracy. But, it's one of those things, it's a buzzword for a reason, right? It improves productivity and morale. And what we're talking about here is giving everyone in the organization an opportunity to contribute. Now, in my case, this included the greater IT, right? So it originally started off as an infrastructure project, but we recruited people from other areas of IT, like the help desk, for example, because these people really were interested in this transformation and they wanted to contribute. When you have a meritocratic environment, though, it's not about seniority. It's about who's producing results. So you give opportunity to everybody, but then you give more opportunity to those who produce results. And that's how you find those people who are just waiting, sometimes their entire career, for this opportunity. I told a story in a previous session about this, and I tell this all the time. You'll be surprised sometimes who your top performers will be in a transformation because it's just a period of great change. It's not always going to be the same people you're used to. Now, I discovered at some point that you can run a report in AWS and it'll tell you who built what. And so of 30 some odd folks, I was shocked to find the number one person was about 60%. I wasn't shocked who it was. I knew this person was a high performer, but I was shocked 60%. They built 60% of this environment, What was everyone else doing? But you have such force multipliers in the cloud that that's possible. Now, the real shock came to me when I saw number 2, and I don't remember what the percentage was that guy that used to be in the help desk. Was just sitting in the corner doing work Nobody didn't talk about it, didn't brag about it. I didn't even know he was doing it, and he was the second most productive person on the team, according to this report. And I wouldn't have had him if I didn't give an opportunity to everyone in the organization. So, of course, I gave him more training and more responsibility. So the formula that I think of as opportunity plus meritocracy equals high performance. So create a meritocracy. Put someone in charge and make them accountable. If everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. Utilize the right incentives. And by the way, I'm a little less nice than Chris when I talk about the accountability. Accountability without authority, I call martyrs. And the authority without accountability, I call tyrants. But you get the picture. So utilize the right incentives. Give everyone in the organization the opportunity to contribute. And then give more opportunity to those who show promise.
Great. We're going to dive into, now that you have a sense of the patterns of success, how do you then execute upon it and gain alignment inside of your organization? I love to ask customers the question, on the spectrum of, I'd never do a business case to I do a business case for everything, where are you on that spectrum? It's almost waterfall or agile, or are you agile somewhere in the middle? And I would say most organizations are likely in the middle. For large investments, they may look at what are those costs, what are the value expected. Some companies, it's more top-down driven or high senior leader driven decision making. But we're going to give you some best practices and maybe a little bit of a takeaway as a part of this, as well as a reference document that you can leverage as you think about how do you bring this all together as a way to create, now that you have the strategy, you have the mechanisms to do it, how do you get buy-in and alignment inside the organization? So I'm not sure of your experience with business cases. I've done thousands probably, and most are rough because you're getting into the weeds and very deep, and you always then question what's the value, or with the value of the tracking after, the tracking before. But when done right, it tells a great story, because I think, as you all know, a lot of these kind of strategies you're implementing come down to a couple key assumptions, and the organization needs to align around where do you think you're going to fall, or what are the scenarios based on that. So as you think about this, I think it's important to think about this business case as a story, because there's both quantitative elements to this, but there's also qualitative elements that come with this. So as you think of the question here, how can cloud be an enabler to help solve problems in a different way inside of your organization as you think about the story of cloud transformation? And as we go through this, obviously it's important to take time to connect the dots. That's what a lot of business cases are intending to do, between IT and the transformation happening there, between the capabilities that you all are creating, but also around the ways it's going to influence the business and the ways in which you can change the way in which you operate. So it's impossible to list all the ways in which you'll benefit, but it's really important to synthesize and to bring this all together so that everyone's aligned around this from a decision-making standpoint. As you think about the way I like to explain this and this notion of painting yourself out of a corner, it's when you transform, you're really making an investment in your organization. You're thinking about what are the ways in which you can drive better decisions, you leverage new capabilities. It's really putting the future first of your organization and the ways in which you drive that. So as you think about this and this ecosystem of going through a cloud transformation, and think of this in terms of painting the picture in a story around the future and working backwards from that and what's needed to get to that end state. So I did put a couple of patterns and anti-patterns that I typically see around this. That hypo is highest paid person's opinion based decision making. This is what you need to do. I've seen a lot of business cases that are very wide open in terms of the interpretation. There's things that tend to, I'm in Amazon now, so we're all about docs in Amazon, but I come from a PowerPoint world prior to then, so everything was in slides. But really making sure that you're documenting that information, but also keeping it active and live. Some of the successful patterns is use data to drive decisions. A lot of times I'll hear customers, go all into the cloud and then kind of look through what it means to their organization after. Some beforehand are like, I think this is going to cost too much. I need to do a different route. And then when I dive into the specifics, you really need to make sure the data is clean as you go through this to drive the decisions. You could read through this, but I think in the end, the key is to foster a conversation inside of your organization, and you all as leaders and knowledge experts in this, to put all the facts together, to partner across parts of the company. It could be through security, architecture, finance. How do you integrate this all together into a story of your organization, and then ultimately allow the data to drive the decision? I mean, it's great for you all to form a point of view and an opinion, and I think leaders are expecting that, but to the same extent, it's really vital to have all that information be there and people to go through that. So You can read through the attributes. This is kind of our point of view around what we see best. Obviously, I know when I did a business case, we acquired a ton of companies through our transformation, so the baseline changed a lot. We also had elements that it was really important to keep things fresh and up to date, but people also had to remember this. You can't just have a meeting a year ago and then everybody remembers it. Leaders change, things evolve. You need to refresh this through time. So depending on the scale of your business case, I would encourage you to think through some refresh cycle. We did it every 6 months as part of my past experience. Some customers I know will do it quarterly. The thing I wouldn't do, and I've engaged with some companies, is they decision cloud transformation on an app-by-app basis. So every app has to be justified. That math won't work out really well. You need to think of this as a portfolio of applications as you go through this, because it's very challenging as you get into this. But as you read through this, I think, and that last point I'll make is on the bottom, typically, especially when you get into a heavy business case culture, I really challenge them to raise the thresholds in which they do all this work, because being on the finance team, I know it takes a lot of work to manage through the dynamics. And a lot of times, investment governance that exists inside of organizations is not really influencing the decisions. It's really just keeping up and sweeping up from behind. So make sure that you're raising the bar on this for material things. And if your organization is going through a cloud transformation, that's obviously material enough. But you can also apply this to other decisions you're making in your business. So I did include kind of a little bit of a flow of a way in which you can think about in defining this, and I'd encourage you to think through it. One is kind of scope, what's in and out. Most of the customers we engage with are not all-in customers. I know we both actually were part of all-in dynamics. Most are unsure. So they're like, I know some workloads that make sense, but I think some things should remain on-prem, and they're in this hybrid world. Or they want to consider kind of a multi-cloud arrangement as they go through this. Whatever's right for your company, you can consider, but you need to define the scope and make it very clear as you go through that. The next thing I love for customers to do and really encourage them is to really think about a do-nothing business case. Because a lot of times people are painting a picture of the future. They don't even consider the investment profile they need to make around if they don't make a transformation and change. So really encourage people to think through, what are the capital investments? What are the technical debt you have in your infrastructure, in your data center? What do you need to do and to maintain that in terms of support levels? Really make sure you spend the time in going through that, because if you don't have that baseline to compare to, it's very hard to make an inference and a judgment on what's better or worse in the future. Next is into scenarios. Again, most business cases come down to 2 or 3 assumptions. I love to scale those assumptions for varying scenarios to see what would happen based on that outcome and what that can flow through. So really think through scenarios. It's not just one way. There's multiple paths. So going into these conversations, it's important to keep that in mind. And then lastly is around socialization. I think it's really critical as you put all this story together to how do you have conversations. I vividly remember soon after building a new data center that we decided to go to the public cloud. We need to go talk to the business leaders around why we felt like that was the right strategy and how it will change the business. So really think through, again, the communication angle of this story as you're going through that. So I won't go through this in detail, but I did want to include this as a reference, and hopefully you can extract this out. I see some people taking pictures, but hopefully you have access to all the materials afterward, because I included all the questions that I would ask in developing a business case. It's very detailed, but you can pick and choose what you think is best and appropriate. But I think it's really critical to think through the elements, not only the investments you need to make around your resources internally, maybe third party you need to engage or partners, but also what's the value you're going to get. And I think the framework we laid out earlier is a great way in which you can think about the value proposition. Oh, there's one more. I'm sorry. Take another picture. I apologize for that. I didn't see that on there. I didn't think that was there. So it gets back to the communication and social side. So, it's a great framework. Obviously, you can Google a lot of things and find this. You may have your own framework. I really encourage, especially if you partner with your finance team, they may already have guidelines and references you can leverage. You can just apply it to the specific investments you're making within IT or the cloud. So you may have seen these takeaways. This is a good summary slide that we thought would be valuable of the key takeaways as we think about not only our experience, but what we see with customers in going through a transformation in the cloud, but also delivering the business value that's expected as you go through that. I really want to emphasize these are great takeaways, and you can apply them as it sees fit in your organization. If there's ever a time in which you're interested, the nice thing about Jake and I, we mentioned we meet with a lot of customers. We'd love to meet with you and your organization if it would be valuable. We've got incredible resources within our team and within AWS that are fully available for you all to take advantage of as we go through that. Obviously, all ways in which to help. You'll see the enterprise strategy. We have a blog on AWS's website, but we're also available. Obviously, there's great partners as well as professional services, which some of you may leverage as well as we go through this. And these are benefits that are available to you to take full advantage of. This is the talk tracks. Jake mentioned he has another one coming up Thursday of the enterprise strategists. These are other talk tracks that we're doing throughout this week. I know a lot of things tend to get filled, but then obviously not everybody comes. So fully take advantage of these, or if these are in your schedule. These is great content that's available along with experts who've been through this. So really want to encourage you as you go through the journey. I would highly recommend all of these speakers in the sessions that are coming up. And the one thing that's really important for our team is around content creation. So all of these books are about authors on the team that we're on. Jake and I, we are not either of those. We have talked about doing a book, but doing a book sounds daunting to me. But there's a lot of people on the team who are authors. And actually all of these authors are actually here at reInvent and will be up in the Executive Summit area. If anybody's interested, we also have books. You can scan those. But if anybody's interested in a physical copy, we also have copies here on site if anybody's interested in any one of these. Or you can order from Amazon if you're interested. Feel free to do that as well. But these are the QR codes that are available, so you can also, when you get the content yourself. And then lastly, obviously, we'd love to connect with you ourselves. As you mentioned, we spend a lot of time talking to customers about business value, about the impediments, the ways in which they can deliver on this. So both Jake and I would love to connect with you as we go through this. So we'll wrap here, but Jake and I are going to be in the hallway right out here. So if anybody wants to talk more or any questions, we really appreciate you taking the time. We also welcome your feedback. So in the mobile app, if you're interested, feel free to add any feedback for us. But it's been a pleasure and hope everybody has a great reInvent.